Look at the billionaire's son's insolence in front of Judge Caprio. What will the punishment be? What if I told you that one morning a billionaire's son walked into court thinking his father's money could buy him out of anything, but walked out having learned the most expensive lesson of his life? This is the story of how Judge Caprio dismantled an empire built on arrogance with just his words. Picture this scene. The courtroom doors swing open and in walks Nathan Reynolds, 22 years old, designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Behind him, his father Charles, a man whose presence fills rooms before he even speaks. Silver hair perfectly styled, cufflinks catching the harsh courtroom lights like tiny spotlights announcing wealth and power. The case seems simple enough on paper. Nathan was caught driving 40 miles per hour over the speed limit in a residential zone. Just another rich kid with a heavy foot, right? But what happened next would expose layers of corruption, manipulation, and moral bankruptcy that ran deeper than anyone imagined. Judge Caprio looked over his reading glasses as Nathan slumped in his chair, barely acknowledging the proceedings. The young man's attitude screamed entitlement. His body language said what his mouth didn't need to. This whole thing was beneath him, a minor inconvenience that Daddy's checkbook would handle. When Judge Caprio asked for Nathan's plea, the response was telling. Nathan didn't even lift his eyes, his voice carrying that particular tone of inherited confidence as he mentioned his attorney calling this merely procedural. But here's where things got interesting. The attorney was nowhere to be found. Instead, Charles Reynolds stood up, speaking as if he were authorizing a business transaction rather than addressing a court of law. He announced he would handle the matter himself, as if legal proceedings were just another board meeting where his word was final. Judge Caprio's eyebrow raised slightly. Here was a grown man whose father was trying to speak for him in court. The judge's response was simple but cutting. He didn't take cash at his bench. He took responsibility. Charles Reynolds tried to flex his community influence, mentioning his donations to police drives and scholarship funds. In his mind, this wasn't about arguing fairness. It was about acknowledging his status. But Judge Caprio had a different perspective. If Charles wasn't there to argue fairness, then he'd come to the wrong room because fairness was exactly what lived in that courtroom. Nathan let out a small, inappropriate laugh, dismissing the whole thing as just speeding, not a felony. But Judge Caprio had done his homework. This wasn't just about speed. Nathan had been clocked near Elm Street at 7:40 in the morning, right when a crossing guard was on duty, helping children get to school safely. The judge's words hit like a physical blow. In a neighborhood where children play, the difference between 20 miles per hour and 60 miles per hour is the difference between a scare and a funeral. The courtroom fell silent. Even Charles Reynolds, for all his bluster, seemed to grasp the weight of that statement. But Charles wasn't done trying to control the narrative. He dismissed the moral implications as theater. Judge Caprio's response was philosophical and devastating. Law without morals, he said, is just paperwork. Every legal proceeding, every rule, every consequence exists because society has agreed on basic principles of right and wrong. As Judge Caprio dug deeper into the case file, more disturbing details emerged. Nathan hadn't just ignored the speed limit. He'd blown past a crossing guard who was actively helping children cross the street. When confronted with this, Nathan claimed he hadn't seen the guard. The judge's observation was profound. Hurry narrows a man's world to the length of his hood ornament. When we're so focused on our own urgent needs, we lose sight of everything and everyone around us. We become dangerous not through malice, but through self-absorption. Charles Reynolds tried to downplay the severity, but Judge Caprio wasn't having it. He made it clear he wanted to hear from Nathan directly, not filtered through his father's interpretation. No coaching, no signals. If Nathan could drive alone, he could speak for himself. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Nathan finally tried to explain himself. He was late, he said. When asked what he was late for, Nathan seemed genuinely confused about why that would matter. This response revealed something crucial about his worldview. His time, his schedule, his convenience were so important that they justified putting others at risk. Judge Caprio's response cut to the heart of entitled thinking. Before they talked about a fine, they needed to discuss why Nathan thought his poor time management should be paid for with risks that other people had to bear. This wasn't just about traffic law. This was about fundamental respect for other human beings. What happened next exposed the deeper corruption in this family's approach to problems. Judge Caprio revealed that this wasn't Nathan's first offense. There had been a previous incident, same charge, but it had been mysteriously closed due to insufficient evidence. The officer's report mentioned Charles Reynolds by name. When confronted, Charles didn't deny his involvement. He simply said he knew people, as if corrupting the legal system was just networking. Judge Caprio's response was devastating. There's a difference between knowing people and knowing right from wrong. The cracks in Nathan's facade started showing. He admitted he didn't want bad press, revealing that his father's intervention wasn't about protecting Nathan from consequences, but about protecting the family image. Nathan had learned to fear his father's disappointment more than legal consequences, and that's how arrogance is born, when fear dresses itself up as pride. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished peeling back the layers of this family's dysfunction. He revealed another incident, property damage in a school zone. Charles had paid $30,000 to repair damage and avoid any formal charges. On the surface, this looked responsible, but the truth was more sinister. Nathan hadn't been driving that day. A friend had been behind the wheel, but the family found it easier to let Nathan take the blame rather than complicate matters with truth. Charles had taught his son that honesty was negotiable, that truth was optional if you had enough money and influence. This revelation shattered something in Nathan. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the moral weight of his family's approach to problems. He hadn't taken the blame, he said. He just hadn't denied it. But Judge Caprio helped him see that this distinction, without a difference, had taught him that truth could be purchased. The most damning revelation came when Judge Caprio mentioned the Reynolds family company's involvement in the city's school safety initiative. The same program that had to repair the fence Charles's cover-up had helped break. The irony was staggering. The man funding safety programs was enabling the very dangers they were designed to prevent. As the first day's proceedings concluded, Judge Caprio delivered a masterpiece of judicial wisdom. He told Charles that when power forgets empathy, it collapses from within. Charles didn't need another dealership or more wealth. He needed humility. Money could rebuild a fence, but it couldn't rebuild a soul. The court recessed until the following morning, giving both father and son time to reflect on what had been exposed. Judge Caprio suggested they decide which cost more, their pride or their peace. When court reconvened the next morning, the atmosphere was completely different. Gone were the cameras, the entourage, the swagger. Just two men, father and son, sitting quietly at the defense table. Charles Reynolds rose before his son could speak, his voice lower and tired. He admitted he'd spent the night thinking about Judge Caprio's words. His revelation was heartbreaking and honest. He'd been running a business longer than he'd been a father. He'd built an empire to ensure his son wouldn't feel small, but in the process, he'd made him hollow instead. Nathan looked startled, as if hearing his father speak honestly for the first time in his life. The facade was crumbling, but underneath was something more genuine than either man had shown in years. Judge Caprio brought in Mrs. Donovan, the elementary school teacher who had witnessed Nathan's reckless driving. Her testimony was devastating. She described walking her class across the street when Nathan's car came speeding through. One of her students had frozen on the curb in fear. If that child had stepped forward just 1 second earlier, they would have been killed. The weight of this near tragedy hit both father and son like a physical blow. Charles admitted he hadn't known children were involved. Judge Caprio's response was simple and damning. Charles hadn't asked. His son had nearly killed a child, and his first instinct had been to cover it up rather than understand what had happened. Nathan's composure finally broke completely. He admitted he hadn't seen the children because he simply hadn't looked. The casual selfishness of this admission hung in the air like an indictment of everything his family represented. Charles tried one last time to justify his actions as parenting, protecting his child from the world's judgment. But Judge Caprio distinguished between protecting children from danger and protecting adults from accountability. Charles had spent so much energy shielding Nathan from consequences that he'd never learned to take responsibility for his actions. The most powerful moment came when Judge Caprio asked when Nathan had last done something wrong without his father cleaning it up. Nathan couldn't remember. This revealed the systematic way Charles had prevented his son from developing a moral compass. As the proceedings continued, Judge Caprio revealed the full scope of the Reynolds family's corruption. Every mistake, every poor choice, every moment where Nathan should have learned from consequences had been smoothed over with money and influence. Nathan finally found his voice, expressing a desire not just to pay a fine, but to do something meaningful to address the harm he'd caused. He wanted to fund safety lessons in elementary schools and speak to students himself, not as a Reynolds heir, but as someone who had almost made a terrible mistake. His father, Charles, announced his own plans for redemption. He would establish a community service program in his company, requiring every employee, including himself, to contribute meaningful time to their community. When Judge Caprio delivered his final verdict, it reflected his understanding that true justice teaches rather than merely punishes. Nathan would perform 200 hours of community service at the schools his company sponsored, speaking to students about accountability and the real-world consequences of selfish choices. Charles would spend a week volunteering in the courthouse as a clerk's assistant, experiencing how justice works when it can't be bought. For a man who had never had to wait for anything, being required to file papers, listen to others, and follow rather than lead would be profoundly educational. The judge's final words captured the transformation that had taken place. Both men had entered trying to protect an image, but they were leaving having discovered something more valuable than all their wealth combined. Integrity. Judge Caprio noted that people often think punishment is the end of a story, but it's actually the beginning of a better one. He reminded them that freedom isn't doing whatever you want, it's doing what's right even when no one applauds. The story's epilogue showed the lasting impact of this courtroom drama. Weeks later, local news captured footage of Nathan and Charles in a school gymnasium, surrounded by children. Nathan was speaking about choices and consequences while his father quietly folded chairs in the background. The video went viral, not because of scandal, but because of genuine humility. Comments praised seeing what redemption actually looks like, not polished or performative, but real and meaningful. Judge Caprio's final words from the hearing played over the video. You can rebuild a business after failure, but when you rebuild a conscience, that's wealth beyond measure. The screen faded with a line beneath the courthouse seal. True justice doesn't punish the heart. It teaches it to beat again. This case represents everything powerful about the American legal system when it works as intended. Judge Caprio didn't just process a traffic ticket. He used his position to hold up a mirror, forcing two people to confront the moral bankruptcy that their wealth and privilege had enabled. The Reynolds family walked into that courtroom believing money could solve any problem, that influence could bend any rule, that consequences were for other people. They discovered that some things can't be purchased, and the most important lessons often come from the moments when our comfortable illusions are stripped away. Nathan learned that being sheltered from consequences doesn't protect you from becoming the kind of person who hurts others. Charles learned that building an empire means nothing if you fail to build character in the people you're supposed to love and guide. Most importantly, Both men discovered that redemption is possible, but only when you're willing to face the truth about yourself without the protective barriers of wealth, status, or family name. Sometimes the most expensive lesson is the one that costs you your illusions but gives you back your humanity. Judge Caprio's courtroom became a classroom that day, teaching lessons about responsibility, humility, and the true meaning of justice that extended far beyond traffic law. In a world where wealth and influence often shield people from consequences, his insistence on accountability and moral growth offered hope that justice can still prevail when administered with wisdom, compassion, and unwavering principle. The transformation of Nathan and Charles Reynolds from entitled, corrupt manipulators to genuinely remorseful people committed to making amends shows that even the most privileged among us can learn, grow, and change when confronted with truth spoken with authority and backed by the power of law applied fairly and wisely.